everyone. Thanks so much for watching this short video that we're producing. This is on using restorative circles or circle processes in higher education classrooms. And we're going to talk a little bit today about the impact of circles, the different applications of circles, and also their design. This work is a collaboration between a number of people, including those who are with us today. My name is Ian Marder, and I'm a criminologist at Maynooth University in Ireland.
My name is Lindsey. I'm an assistant professor at Vermont Law School and with the National Center on Restorative Justice, which is a partnership between Vermont Law School, University of Vermont, University of San Diego, and the U.S. Office of Justice Programs.
And my name is Alanna Ojibway. I also work with Lindsey at the National Center on Restorative Justice, and I am the program manager for the Center for Justice Reform at Vermont Law School.
And we were also joined in organizing the work around this presentation by our colleague Rowan Sweeney, who's a PhD student at York St. John University, but who can't be with us as we record this today. But it's important to mention that this is something that was co-designed by a number of people, all of whom teach restorative justice or restorative practices at universities or at higher education institutions. So this is the result of an event of the Restorative Justice Pedagogy Network, which is a network of around 140 people from over 40 countries, all of whom work or teach at higher education institutions in the field of restorative justice and restorative practices. And as one of our workshops that we undertook on the topic of participation and experiential learning in restorative justice classrooms, we developed these slides collectively with over 30 people from 13 countries, including some of the people you see here who are listed not because they're the only people who participated, but because they gave us explicit permission to include their names on this presentation. So you can see we have colleagues from Canada, from the US, and from institutions also in Ireland, Italy, the Netherlands, and the UK as well.
So the intended audience for this presentation is really specifically for those who are teaching in higher education and have some level of exposure to circles or restorative processes, but not necessarily those who are teaching restorative justice explicitly. So we hope that this gives a little more context for those who are interested in expanding the use of circles in higher education settings.
Great. So the first question that we asked for input on from those 32 members of the Restorative Pedagogy Network who gathered and were part of this collaborative design process is this question of what is a circle, or more specifically, how do you introduce the circle process to your class or colleagues when you're bringing it into your class for the first time, or perhaps encouraging colleagues to also use circle process in their teaching. And the responses that we received from the members who were part of this dialogue really fell into three categories. So first, people mentioned that they give a simple explanation of circle process. So something really brief along the lines of it's a facilitated discussion, a way to have a respectful conversation in which every person has a turn to speak without being interrupted. It was notable that folks mentioned that they don't go into a lot of detail at that point and felt that it can kind of do more harm than good to give too much detail in that description, just a really brief overview of what type of dialogue is being set up by the circle process. Second strategy was to highlight the impact. So talk about how this is a way to build relationship, to build trust, to develop community, to facilitate important conversations that need to happen in the classroom. So really focusing more on the impact rather than describing in much detail what a circle process is. And then the third strategy was to just have folks experience it, really do the show, don't tell approach, giving people an experience of the circle process so that they can feel what a circle is and what it's capable of, rather than trying to gain buy-in through a verbal explanation. One member of this discussion mentioned that no one explains why a classroom is set up auditorium style. So maybe by just having chairs arranged in a circle when students arrive to the classroom, we're helping to normalize this way of engaging with each other and really, highlighting what a circle can do and kind of subverting that classroom just in how we're arranging furniture. So just diving into the experience with students or colleagues. One quote that stuck out when we were kind of going through the material that we gathered around this "what is a circle" question was this idea that we are all teachers and learners in this space. So really setting up, particularly as a faculty member holding a circle, that it's an equalizing space where all students will have voice along with the instructor. Anything, Ian or Alanna, you'd add as takeaways from this slide?
I think that looks great.
Awesome.
All good?
Good.
So you might be someone who teaches or is come across restorative justice, but who has never been trained in using restorative practices. You might be someone who teaches in a higher education institution and uses restorative practices regularly, and your colleagues have maybe sat in circles with you and now are interested in using circles themselves. Or you may be one of those people who you have a colleague, maybe a member of this pedagogy network, who has used restorative practices, used circle processes in their teaching. You might have observed or participated in that, and now you're thinking about how you might use circles in some of your own work. So here we have initially some of the reasons why you might want to use circles in higher education teaching. As you can see, there's a number of possible reasons or rationales behind their use. One of the main rationales of the circle process is that it helps people to connect. It breaks down those barriers through that dialogue that you have in ways that build trust and build relationships and community, something that the way that higher education is normally set up, there isn't a lot of space dedicated to relationship building, to trust building. But by sharing experiences, by hearing from each other in this very equitable process, you can build the trust and those relationships. And that's really important in learning, because students learn better when they feel connected and when they feel socially and emotionally safe. So if your students feel comfortable in the room, they'll be able to let their guard down a little bit, or perhaps even more accurately, feel in a position where they can engage really thoroughly and openly with the learning. Also, you might have circles that help to overcome bias and overcome assumptions. So you're helping people join together to understand and humanize each other. If you're like me, you teach criminology, that might be a circumstance where some people have experience of something to do with crime or victimization that other people don't understand, or other people have assumptions about some demographic factor in relation to someone. And if you have that open conversation, you can overcome some of those biases. Now, another thing that is important in higher education is having a participatory classroom where people feel comfortable speaking. And a circle process is something where everyone has an equal opportunity to speak. So by having circles, even if you just do one at the beginning of a couple of classes, you can set that precedent of open communication. You can also ensure that every student feels seen, feels heard, and feels respected. It's a totally different dynamic where everyone is encouraged and has that opportunity to speak, versus a situation where maybe a small number of louder or more confident people dominate the dialogue. And giving everyone that chance to speak, it can really deepen engagement with and reflection on class topics. And that also relates to another dynamic of circles, which is that it helps people express emotion. So it helps you talk about feelings, talk about emotional reactions to some materials you might have engaged with, or indeed your emotional relationship with the course itself and the learning experience. And so similarly to what we've mentioned, this is about priming the brain for learning, welcoming the whole person into the classroom. And it builds those communication skills as well. People participate in a lot of circles. They're more comfortable speaking with each other. They're more comfortable speaking in public, and authentic listening is really important as well. The talking piece is not just for to indicate who is talking in circles, it's to indicate whose turn it is to listen, and not to think about what they're going to say when it comes around to them, but to really take that time to hear what other people are saying. And all of this contributes to subverting power and hierarchy. Lecturing, Lindsey before talked about, the auditorium style, where there's this really clear, the lecturer is somehow above or isolated from all the students who are somehow lesser than the lecturer. Restorative practice circles are the opposite of that. Everyone is there together. The circle indicates that usually you might do it with no table in the middle. Everyone gets a turn to speak, and that creates an equitable co-learning environment. Anything to add to that slide, either Lindsey or Alanna?
It looks great.
One thing I'll add just quickly, a kind of reflection from my experience, just to highlight this idea of welcoming the whole person. It's important to note that that's true for students. And I certainly know, students reflect that when a circle is used in class, there's this sense of, community and engaging with their whole self, but also for the faculty member. I can just say from personal experience, it's wonderful to feel that I can bring my whole self to a class as well, and kind of have that same kind of vulnerability in the classroom environment and be kind of a full person and not just the intellectual parts of me. So just to point that kind of humanizing aspect is for everyone in the room.
That actually, to one more point related to that you just made me think about, Lindsey, is I think important to note that one of the unique and I think most one of the special sort of components of being in circle is that participation, and thinking about what it means to show up in a more humanizing way is that participation can look like passing, and you can still be sitting and participating in circle, which is different and unique from sort of that traditional auditorium style setup where it could reflect lack of engagement, lack of caring, but you can clearly still be participating and be invested in the conversation while choosing to opt out and pass. So that's, I just was reflecting on that when you mentioned sort of the humanizing piece. So in thinking about also, and in this conversation, we talked about what types of specific applications might be. These are really for a framework as examples of types of applications. Of course, there are others, but these were some of the common threads that came up in this conversation about the ways that circles have been used in classroom spaces that we've seen and shared with others. So first and foremost, I think the one that came up the most obviously is just the relationship and community building component of this. And really just to say that could be something that comes in at the beginning of times together, at the beginning of semesters, but also throughout. So relationship building is beautiful in that it's relevant really at any point in the relationship. So that's one that came up the most. And then to discuss and connect personally with course material and content. This could be reflecting on sharing experiences about a certain assignment or sharing reflections on readings, but again, in a way that's really humanizing and looking at not sort of necessarily just reflecting on answers, but really looking at what did people think and feel, and invite a way to think about personal experience as it relates to content in classroom spaces. Another component that came up was co-creating classroom norms. And again, this is one that whether this comes in at the beginning of establishing that when this group or classroom is first getting to know each other, or again, throughout, this is a good sort of checking in if there is some kind of harm that occurs. This would be another good example of when that might be useful to think about reintroducing, to talk about co-creating classroom norms and have students give that input as well about what that time together, what they can expect in those relationships with each other, what kind of agreements are a part of that, and the values reflecting that. It's also really useful as a way of sort of learning by doing in experiential learning and creating equality in participation. Related, I guess, to also to the classroom norms is making decisions. So this could come up really in a variety of ways. It could come up in terms of how something should be done, if there should be a response to something in a particular way. It could be in terms of assignments and how we look at assessment. That is another interesting example of thinking about collective decision making and using equal voice to have a role in decisions that are made in the classroom. And then the other final piece that had come up in thinking about was really an opportunity to create a space to discuss the happy and the sad, and making time to celebrate or process things that really are sort of collective sentiments from the group, whether that's positive or negative, but creating a space to sort of be together and process or celebrate that.
Great. So another piece that we asked those gathered for this collaborative design process to reflect on was, what advice do they have for designing circle questions? So what guidance would you give someone who's looking to bring circle practice and thinking about, how am I going to decide on the circle questions that I'll use? One of the main themes that arose was that great circle questions offer choice. They're not too prescriptive, and they're also not too broad, but they create a range of kind of the amount of vulnerability they invite, of ways of answering them, so that those who are participating in the circle can kind of opt in at their comfort level based on kind of the trust and comfort that's been built in the group, and always feel that they have, something that they can add and that feels safe to share without being too broad. And of course, with this, caveat that it's always okay to pass, and that is a form of participation, as Alanna said. So thinking about that, where is the choice? Where is the invitation to vulnerability and deep sharing, but not making it prescriptive, making it flexible, depending on the feeling of trust and comfort that's been built up in the group. These questions are open-ended, so not just a simple yes/no question, something that's more open, and affective, so related to emotions, inviting kind of more of an emotional reflection or sharing, inviting that vulnerability in a brave space where we're sharing each other. Making sure that everyone can answer the question, and that really involves a consideration of privilege. So are you asking about the best vacation that everyone's been on? And that's going to highlight privilege really quickly. Or, is it a question, can you craft it in a way that makes sure that everyone's going to be able to answer it and it's going to feel good to answer? So just considering how your questions are going to land and create and relate to broader structures of privilege and power. Using metaphors and imagery to prompt emotions and creativity is a really good strategy. We talked through some examples of this. One that came up was as we are in the springtime in the Northern Hemisphere right now, a recent question around seeds and what seeds are you planting right now in your life? So that kind of metaphor, that imagery can invite in a deeper level of sharing, and also create space for people to take it in a lot of different directions. So, some people might answer that question with literal seeds that they're planting in their garden, some with personal intentions in their family life or their friendships or in their professional life. And so there's a lot of ways you can go, and using that metaphor, that imagery helps to kind of draw out that more creative and emotional self while creating that range and that choice in how folks answer questions. In terms of thinking about the chronology of questions and how you kind of scaffold questions in a circle that has multiple rounds of questions, participants in our collaborative design process talked about the importance of first building that community, that trust, that safety, sharing and engaging in dialogue. So maybe a community building, just basic relationship building question to build comfort with circle and with each other. Perhaps that also involves a circle round that helps to establish norms for the circle and agreed upon guidelines for how the circle participants will engage with each other. Then moving from there into the main issues. So is it course content that you're wanting to reflect on more deeply? Is it a dialogue that needs to happen in the class? So moving into kind of the main issues, and then how to move forward. So what comes next? What's next from this? So this kind of chronology of those questions is going to vary depending on the overall purpose of the circle, but just being really mindful in your design process when there are multiple circle rounds of how am I scaffolding those questions on each other. even if it's just a relationship building circle, but with multiple rounds, making sure that you're asking for increasingly slightly more vulnerability each round. So you're going deeper and deeper in that relationship building, that invitation of vulnerability each round, not starting as deep as you can go, because that won't contribute to the kind of safe engagement for folks. Another piece of advice that came up was to give up so as the instructor in the room, as the facilitator, give up that role of coming up with questions as soon as possible. So having circle participants propose their own questions, and furthermore, giving up that facilitator role as quickly as possible. So having students rotate holding the responsibility of, for example, facilitating an opening circle at the beginning of each class or a closing circle at the end of each class. And I'll just speak briefly from my own experience with this is students come up with way more awesome circle questions and structures than I ever could using all of my best efforts and creative faculties. It's amazing where the conversation can go when you're collectively sharing the responsibility for circle design and facilitation. It really helps. It helps it to go deeper and for those conversations to happen at the pace of comfort of your students, where they feel that they are as a classroom community. And then final piece of advice here is just to reflect on and test your questions. So a question might sound great to you, but maybe ask a couple friends. Would you feel comfortable or be excited to answer this circle question? Kind of test them out, refine them, and always be willing to refine them after trying them in a circle too, before bringing them to a subsequent circle. Anything either of you would add?
Nope, all good.
All good. So next we get into sort of thinking about how to start and establishing, really first and foremost, setting circle guidelines in your classroom spaces. So the first point is really just opening up this time to invite a circle process for thinking about guidelines. And so this would be a time to go around and ask students what values and agreements are important to them personally and individually, and what would they want from their peers. And so really providing that space to start first and foremost with community and opening up that time to hear their feedback to design what circle guidelines is important to them and in that space. And then some of these other ones that came up are really just sort of foundational components that are really important if they don't come up naturally in that initial circle guideline conversation. So one of them being setting guidelines around confidentiality and respect, listening to each other, being respectful of each other. Part of that also includes obviously confidentiality and just establishing agreements around what comes up in conversation in those circles to honor that and respect that space, that it doesn't leave that circle. Also considering how, as Lindsey had mentioned, some of the particular questions and framing, to just think about how those can be framed in a way to ensure equal voice. So as Ian had also mentioned, the talking piece is a great example that not only signifies who's talking, but also represents who is listening, and to establish that equal voice, as well as however it gets framed. I think a common phrase is sort of the idea of step up, step back. But I think that's an important piece to this, is just being mindful of not only giving equal time for an opportunity, but really being mindful of how you're taking up time and space and giving opportunity to others in an equal way. Related to that, thinking about what does it mean to be creating safety for others in this space. And I think that's an important guideline question, perhaps in the introductory round, to think about what does safety look like, feel like for individual students, and knowing that perhaps the way to do that may be outside of the circle through one-on-one relationships, if there are particular things that students feel make them feel unsafe in the classroom setting, to be mindful of that. And so to offer that opportunity both within the circle, but to bring it in if it needs to be a conversation outside of that as well. And then being mindful of time and not starting a circle conversation if there really isn't realistic time or capacity to invite that as a space of reflection and to have everyone have an opportunity to speak. I think this can be a challenge, certainly at the end of conversations, if this comes up and it feels rushed, and then you potentially have to shorten answers or run the risk of not having an opportunity for everyone to have a turn. So that's one piece. And then if it comes up earlier, I think similarly, just important to set expectations and guidelines if it is going to be, say, an introductory circle, to just be clear about even a simple prompt of, we'll be spending the first 15 minutes in this opening circle with said prompt, but just giving clear expectations around how much time you plan to spend so that students can have that time to ensure equal voice. Anything else, Ian or Lindsey, wanted to add to that piece?
Great.
No, that's everything, I think. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us for this short video. If you're really interested in restorative practices and circle processes in higher education settings, there's lots of things you can do. First of all, you can join the Restorative Justice Pedagogy Network by emailing me on ian.marder@mu.ie. You can also, if you teach restorative justice or restorative practices, check out recordings of our previous workshops on the Vermont Law School YouTube channel. You can also find lots and lots of games and exercises for teaching restorative approaches on the Restorative Teaching Tools website or in the Little Book of Restorative Teaching Tools. And in the same series, of course, there is also Kay Pranis's Little Book of Circle Processes. But primarily, I'd say if you're interested in circle processes, get some training, because there are half-day, 1-day, 3-day training opportunities. There may very well be fantastic trainers in your local area or in your jurisdiction who can train you in the skills and art of facilitating circles, of using restorative practices, and of thinking about different applications in your professional arena. And of course, there's been academic research and articles on such things as using restorative practices in plagiarism cases, using circles in residential settings in higher education, using circles for engaging students in talking about assessments or in reviewing and redesigning modules, and other areas around restorative practices in higher education. So for now, thanks so much. Hope this was really useful. Get in touch, keep in touch, and keep working in this area. Thanks so much, everyone.